Imagine running for your freedom, only to be caught. The Roman executioner approaches, not with a sword for your neck, but with a blade for your feet. Because in ancient Rome, if you dared to escape slavery, they didn't just punish you, they made sure you could never run again. Your feet gone, your future destroyed. This is the story of Rome's most terrifying punishment for runaway slaves. And what happened next will shock you to your core. Picture this: ancient Rome, the most powerful empire on earth. Marble temples reaching toward the sky. Victorious generals parading through golden streets. But beneath this glory existed a dark foundation that made it all possible. 40% of Rome's population was slaves. Not 10%, not 20, 40. That means if you walked through the streets of Rome, 4 out of every 10 people you passed were someone's property. These weren't just workers, they were human tools, bought and sold like cattle. How did people become slaves? The most common way was war. When Rome conquered a nation, they didn't just take the land. They took the people. Soldiers who fought against Rome became slaves. Women and children from defeated cities became slaves. Entire populations were marched to Rome in chains to be sold in massive slave markets. But war wasn't the only path to slavery. Some people were enslaved as punishment for crimes. Others were born into it. If your mother was a slave, you were automatically a slave too, no matter who your father was. And in the cruelest twist of fate, abandoned babies left to die in dumps outside the city were sometimes collected and raised as slaves. These enslaved people built Rome's roads, harvested its food, cleaned its homes, and served its citizens. They had no rights, no freedom, and no hope of escape. Or did they? Some tried, some ran, and when they were caught, Rome made an example of them that would echo through history. The punishment was so brutal, so permanent, that it became a legend of terror. What happened to those who dared to run? Escaping slavery in ancient Rome wasn't like walking out a door. It was a death-defying gamble, where the odds were stacked impossibly against you. Imagine you're a slave in a Roman household. You work from sunrise to sunset. You're beaten for the smallest mistake. You watch your children taken away to be sold. One night you decide enough. You're going to run, but how? You have no money, no documents, no map. The Roman Empire stretches thousands of miles in every direction, and you don't even know where you are. You speak a language that marks you as foreign. Your clothes, your accent, your very appearance screams slave. Still, some tried. They waited for moments when their masters weren't watching. They exploited gaps in security. They fled during festivals when the household was distracted. Some ran alone. Others fled in small groups, hoping there was safety in numbers. The lucky ones had a plan. Maybe they knew of a distant relative in another city. Maybe they'd heard rumors of communities where runaway slaves hid. Some headed for the mountains, hoping to disappear into the wilderness. Others tried to blend into the crowds of big cities, hoping to pass as free laborers. But here's the terrifying truth. Most didn't make it. Rome had systems in place to catch runaways. Professional slave catchers patrolled the roads. Innkeepers were required to report suspicious travelers. Neighbors informed on each other for rewards. Even other slaves would betray runaways, knowing that helping an escapee meant sharing their punishment. And when you were caught, and most were caught, that's when the real horror began. Because Rome didn't just want to punish you. They wanted to make sure you could never run again. Ever. The moment a slave went missing, the hunt began with ruthless efficiency. First, the master would check the immediate area. Maybe the slave was just hiding somewhere on the property, hoping the danger would pass. But if they couldn't be found quickly, the master moved to the next level, spreading the word. In Rome, there was an entire network dedicated to finding runaways. The master would alert neighbors, asking if anyone had seen the escaped slave. He'd question other slaves in the household, threatening them with punishment if they didn't reveal what they knew. Fear of torture made many slaves betray their friends. Then came the slave catchers, professional hunters who made their living tracking down runaways. These men knew every trick, every hiding place, every route that escapees typically took. They were paid bounties for every slave they returned. which made them relentlessly motivated. Some were former slaves themselves, using their insider knowledge to hunt down others like them. The empire had another weapon, the reward system. Masters would post notices offering money for information leading to their slaves' capture. In a society where many people struggled to survive, these rewards were tempting. A single tip could mean food for a month. So people watched. They listened. They informed runaway slaves couldn't trust anyone. That person offering you shelter might turn you in tomorrow. That fellow traveler on the road might be a spy. Even other slaves couldn't always be trusted. Some hoped that betraying a runaway would earn them favor with their masters, and Rome kept records. If you were caught and returned, your description was noted. Your escape attempt was documented. Future buyers would know you were a runner. This made you less valuable, more likely to face harsher treatment. But first, you had to survive what came next, the punishment. When slave catchers finally cornered their prey, there was no mercy, no negotiation, no second chance. Picture the scene. You've been running for days, maybe weeks. You're exhausted, starving, sleeping in forests or abandoned buildings. Every sound makes you jump. Every stranger might be your doom. Then one morning or one night they find you. Maybe it's on a road. Maybe it's in a town where someone recognized you. Maybe another slave, broken by threats, finally told them where you were hiding. The slave catchers surround you. There's nowhere left to run. Some slaves fought back, knowing that death in battle was better than what awaited them. Others fell to their knees, begging for mercy that would never come. A few tried one final desperate dash for freedom, only to be brought down by clubs or nets. The capture itself was brutal. Slave catchers didn't need to be gentle. Damaged property was still property. They'd bind the runaways' hands and feet with heavy chains. Some catchers used special restraints designed specifically for slaves, wooden blocks that locked around the ankles, making walking painful and running impossible. Others used iron collars with long spikes radiating outward, preventing the wearer from lying down comfortably or hiding in brush. Then began the journey back. The captors would drag or force-march the escapee back to their master, often taking days to return. The runaway was displayed publicly along the route, a walking warning to other slaves. This is what happens when you try to escape. But the journey back was nothing compared to what awaited at the destination. The master would be waiting, and he would be angry, very angry, because now it was time to make an example that every slave in the household would remember forever. Roman masters didn't punish escaped slaves in private. They did it publicly, deliberately, making it a spectacle of terror. When the runaway was brought back, the entire household was assembled to watch. Every slave, from the oldest to the youngest, was required to witness what happened next. This wasn't just about punishing one person, it was about controlling everyone. The captured slave would be stripped and dragged to the center of the courtyard or a public square. Some masters invited neighbors to watch, turning the punishment into a community event. The message was clear: this is Rome's justice. This is what defiance costs. The master would often address the crowd first, listing the slave's crimes. This slave betrayed my trust. This slave stole from me by taking himself. This slave thought he could defy the natural order. The rhetoric painted the runaway not as a human seeking freedom, but as a criminal, a thief, a threat to society itself. Then the master would announce the punishment. For first-time offenders, it might be just a brutal flogging, dozens or even hundreds of lashes that would leave permanent scars. The whip used wasn't a simple leather strap. It was often a flagrum, a multi-tailed whip with pieces of metal or bone woven into the strands, designed to tear flesh with every strike. Some runaways were branded. A hot iron would press against their forehead, burning the letter F into their skin. F for fugitivus, runaway. This mark was permanent. For the rest of their life, everyone who looked at them would know they had tried to escape. Even if they were later freed, the brand remained. A permanent mark of shame. But for repeat offenders, for those who ran multiple times, or for those the master wanted to make an especially terrifying example of, there was a punishment far worse than scars or brands. For slaves who repeatedly attempted escape, or in cases where masters wanted to send the most extreme message possible, Rome had a punishment that went beyond pain or humiliation. It was mutilation, specifically amputation of the feet or legs. This wasn't common. Historical records describe it as rare and extreme, but it happened, and when it did, it achieved exactly what Rome intended: absolute terror. Think about the logic from Rome's twisted perspective. A branded slave could still run. A beaten slave could heal and run again. A slave sent to work in brutal conditions could potentially escape from there too. But a slave without feet, they couldn't run, they couldn't walk properly. They couldn't escape ever again. This punishment appeared in Roman law under Emperor Constantius Flavius Valerius Aurelius in the 4th century CE. The legislation was explicit. Slaves caught trying to escape imprisonment could be killed, sent to hard labor in the mines, or subjected to amputation of a leg. The choice was the master's or the state's, depending on the circumstances. The threat of this punishment was psychological warfare. Imagine being a slave, hearing stories of others who tried to run and lost their feet. Would you risk it? Could you take that chance? Rome wanted slaves to be so terrified of the consequences that they wouldn't even try. But the punishment wasn't just about preventing future escapes. It was about making the victim completely dependent. A slave who couldn't walk properly couldn't work in fields. They couldn't carry heavy loads. They became a burden, a living reminder to all other slaves of what defiance cost. And here's the darkest part. The amputation was often done without any medical care. No anesthesia, no proper surgical tools, no treatment to prevent infection. It was butchery, pure and simple. How was this amputation actually carried out? The historical record suggests methods that would haunt your nightmares. In most cases, this wasn't performed by trained physicians. It was carried out by executioners, overseers, or even blacksmiths, people who had tools and weren't squeamish about using them on human bodies. The victim would be restrained, often tied to a post or held down by multiple people. There was no anesthesia in the modern sense. At best, the victim might be given strong wine to dull the pain slightly. More often, they received nothing. The instruments varied. Some used axes or cleavers, quick but imprecise. One heavy blow aimed at the ankle or lower leg. Others used saws, the same tools used for woodworking, slowly cutting through bone and flesh. The process could take agonizing minutes, with the victim screaming throughout. The location of the cut mattered. Some amputations were at the ankle, removing just the foot. This left the slave alive but immobile. Others cut higher, at the shin or even the knee, removing more of the leg. The higher the cut, the less chance of survival, but also the more dramatic the warning to others. Bleeding was the immediate danger. Without proper cauterization or surgical techniques, victims could bleed to death within minutes. Some masters wanted this. Death by amputation served as execution. Others wanted the slave to survive as a living example, so they might apply hot iron to the wound to seal blood vessels, causing excruciating additional pain. Infection was the next threat. In a world without antibiotics or sterile procedures, any open wound could become deadly. The stump would be exposed to dirt, insects, and bacteria. Many victims who survived the initial amputation died days or weeks later from gangrene or sepsis, their bodies slowly poisoned by infection. For those who survived the amputation itself, a new nightmare began, living with the aftermath. The pain didn't end when the cutting stopped. Phantom limb pain, the sensation that the missing foot or leg is still there and hurting, tormented victims. Without modern pain management, they endured this agony with no relief. The stump itself would remain painful for months or even years as it healed. Basic survival became nearly impossible. In a world without wheelchairs or prosthetics for slaves, mobility meant everything. How do you work when you can't walk? How do you even move around to get food or water? Many amputee slaves became entirely dependent on others, begging fellow slaves for help. Some masters provided crude crutches, not out of mercy, but because a slave who could move slightly was slightly more useful than one who couldn't move at all. These were rough wooden poles, uncomfortable and difficult to use, causing blisters and sores under the arms. The social impact was devastating. In slave communities, your value came from your ability to work. An amputee couldn't do heavy labor, couldn't run errands efficiently, couldn't serve in most capacities. They became the lowest of the low, often mocked even by other slaves who feared being associated with a marked troublemaker. Hygiene became a nightmare. Without proper mobility, amputees couldn't clean themselves properly. They couldn't reach latrines easily. Many developed sores from sitting or lying in one position for too long. These sores could become infected, leading to more medical complications, and psychologically, imagine living every day as a warning to others. Every person who looked at you saw not a human being, but a lesson. Don't try to escape. You became a living monument to Rome's cruelty, your mutilated body a permanent advertisement for submission. The mental torture was perhaps worse than the physical. The true purpose of foot amputation wasn't just punishing one person. It was controlling thousands through fear. Every slave who witnessed an amputation punishment carried that image forever. Children as young as 5 or 6 were made to watch, ensuring the terror started early. These memories shaped behavior for life. When you saw someone's foot hacked off, heard their screams, watched them bleed and writhe in agony, you didn't forget. Ever. Masters understood this psychological warfare perfectly. When brutal punishment could keep dozens or hundreds of slaves compliant for years. Why risk a rebellion when everyone knew what rebellion cost? Why attempt escape when the consequence was displayed before your eyes daily in the form of a crippled former runaway? The amputee became a living teaching tool. New slaves arriving at a household would be shown the victim. See him? He tried to run. This is what happens. The message was clear and undeniable. You couldn't argue with the evidence of someone's missing feet. This created a culture of absolute fear. Slaves policed each other, reporting anyone who talked about escape or showed signs of planning to run. Better to betray a friend than risk being associated with escape attempts. The Roman system didn't just rely on physical chains. It built chains in people's minds. Some slaves internalized the message so completely they gave up even the idea of freedom. Why dream of something that would only bring horror? Better to accept your lot, work hard, hope for small mercies. Rome didn't just want to prevent escape, they wanted to kill the very desire for freedom, and it worked. Historical records show that despite millions of slaves in the Roman Empire, organized rebellions were rare. Individual escape attempts, while they happened, were not as common as one might expect, given the massive enslaved population. Fear, enforced through spectacular brutality, kept the system functioning. Roman law didn't see foot amputation of slaves as murder or torture. It saw it as property management. Under Roman legal philosophy, slaves weren't people, they were things. The Latin term was res, meaning object or thing, the same legal category as a chair or a farm animal. And just as you could do whatever you wanted with your chair, masters had nearly unlimited rights over their slaves' bodies. This legal framework was codified over centuries. The 12 Tables, Rome's oldest law code, established that masters could punish slaves essentially without limit. Later laws added some minor protections. For instance, you theoretically couldn't kill a slave without reason, but enforcement was weak and exceptions were broad. The key legal principle was that slaves had no legal personhood. They couldn't own property, couldn't testify in court except under torture, couldn't marry legally, couldn't have families recognized by law. They existed in a legal void where normal rules didn't apply. When Emperor Constantine introduced amputation as an official punishment for escaped slaves in the 4th century CE, it wasn't controversial. It was simply formalizing what some masters were already doing privately. The law gave 3 options for caught runaways: execution, hard labor in mines, or amputation. All 3 were considered legitimate, and the choice was at the authorities' discretion. Roman legal scholars debated these punishments, but not on moral grounds. They debated efficiency and economics. Was it better to kill an escaped slave, losing the investment entirely, or to mutilate them, keeping them as a warning but losing their labor productivity? These were practical questions about resource management, not human rights. This legal framework meant that no master ever faced consequences for amputating a slave's feet. There were no trials, no investigations, no penalties. It was simply accepted as part of maintaining social order. The law protected masters, not slaves, and this legal immunity meant brutality could flourish without check. Foot amputation as punishment for escaped slaves wasn't unique to Rome. The practice appeared across ancient civilizations, revealing a dark thread in human history. In ancient Greece, similar punishments existed. While Greek slavery was less systematically brutal than Roman slavery, runaways still faced severe consequences, including mutilation. The island of Crete's legal codes, particularly the Gorton Code from the 3rd century BCE, detailed punishments for slave infractions. Though amputation wasn't as explicitly documented as in Roman sources, the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, dating back to 1750 BCE, over 1,000 years before Rome's peak, prescribed amputation as punishment for various crimes, including slaves who used force against free citizens. This suggests the practice was ancient even by Roman standards. In ancient Peru, archaeological evidence shows amputation was used as judicial punishment. Pottery and ceramics from the 4th century BCE depict amputations of feet and legs, suggesting this was common enough to be portrayed in art. The Byzantine Empire, which succeeded Rome, continued and expanded these practices. Emperor Leo III made crucial reforms, replacing the death penalty with amputation, arguing it was more merciful. But for slaves and criminals, this mercy meant a lifetime of disability and suffering. Even Islamic empires later adopted similar punishments, though their legal frameworks were different. The practice of amputating feet for various crimes appeared across multiple cultures and religions. This widespread use of amputation reveals something disturbing about human societies. Across different civilizations, cultures, and time periods, people independently arrived at the same brutal conclusion that mutilating human bodies was an acceptable way to maintain power and control. The practice wasn't about different values or ancient ignorance. It was about power. Those who had it used the most extreme methods to keep it, and those without power suffered in remarkably similar ways across the world. How and when did foot amputation as punishment for slaves finally end? The decline wasn't sudden or driven by moral awakening. It was gradual, practical, and uneven across different regions. In the Roman Empire, several factors contributed to the decrease of such extreme punishments. First, economic changes. As the Roman Empire's military expansion slowed during the Pax Romana, 1st, 2nd centuries CE, the flood of war captives dried up. Slaves became more expensive and harder to replace. Destroying your property's ability to work made less economic sense when you couldn't easily get replacement workers. Second, the rise of Christianity introduced new, though limited, ethical considerations. Early Christian teachings suggested slaves had souls, even if they didn't have rights. Some Christian writers argued against the most extreme cruelties, though they didn't oppose slavery itself. This created slight social pressure against the worst excesses. Third, slave rebellions, particularly the famous Spartacus revolt, showed that excessive brutality could backfire. Desperate people with nothing to lose became dangerous. Some theorists argued that moderate treatment and the possibility of eventual freedom, manumission, made slaves more compliant than pure terror. However, we must be clear, these punishments didn't end because people suddenly realized they were wrong. Even as foot amputation became rarer, other brutal punishments continued. Slavery itself continued for centuries more. The Byzantine Empire kept using amputation as punishment well into the Middle Ages. In some parts of the world, judicial amputation continued into modern times. Saudi Arabia used it until very recently. Sudan still had cases in the 21st century. The practice evolved and migrated, but never truly disappeared. The specific practice of amputating feet of escaped slaves faded not because humanity became more humane, but because slavery's economic model changed and different forms of control became more efficient. The cruelty didn't end, it just transformed. What should we take away from this dark chapter of human history? First, the sheer scale of suffering. We've focused on one specific punishment, but remember, this was just one tool in Rome's arsenal of cruelty. Millions of people lived and died in slavery, facing daily brutality we can barely imagine. The foot amputation cases, while rare, represent the extreme end of a system built entirely on violence and dehumanization. Second, the efficiency of terror. Rome didn't need to amputate every runaway slave's feet. They just needed to do it enough times, publicly enough that everyone knew it could happen. That's the insidious genius of spectacular punishment. One victim terrorizes thousands. Modern authoritarian regimes learned this lesson well. Third, the legal and social structures that enable atrocity. Foot amputation wasn't a crime in Rome. It was legal property management. This shows how laws can codify evil, how entire societies can accept the unacceptable when it's normalized and institutionalized. The people who performed these amputations weren't necessarily monsters. They were ordinary people following their culture's rules. Fourth, the importance of recognizing slaves' humanity and resistance. Despite overwhelming odds, despite knowing the horrific consequences, some people still chose to run. That takes extraordinary courage. These weren't passive victims. They were freedom fighters who risked everything for a chance at liberty. Finally, we must remember that slavery's legacy didn't end with Rome. The transatlantic slave trade, modern human trafficking, forced labor today, the underlying dynamics of human ownership and exploitation continue. Different methods, same fundamental evil. The story of foot amputation in ancient Rome isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror, showing us what humans are capable of when power is unchecked, when some people are classified as less than human, and when law protects the powerful instead of the vulnerable. We must never forget, and we must ensure it never happens again.